Hello and welcome to Jung at Harp. My name is Deborah Henson-Conant. I am a composer and a performer, and I teach harp players around the world how to liberate themselves from the notes on the page of music. And I am here with Kathleen Wiley, who is a Jungian analyst, and we both play the harp. And thus, this is called Jung at Harp. And today we are going to talk about change. What is it, and how do you do it?
And sometimes, how do you just survive when it's happening unbidden
Oh,
or
that's a really
unanticipated?
okay. So that's a really interesting. Okay,
That's another
great.
sin,
All
because
right.
sometimes change just begins to happen, and we have to be able to then adjust accordingly when there are changes in ourself, in our body, in our own interest, our own expectations, our own energy system, our own
Wow,
interest.
that's great. So I think it sounds like there's sort of three areas of change that I'm thinking of. I'm sure there's more, but now I'm thinking there's when we want to change. How do
Mhm.
we do that? There's when change is happening, whether we wanted it or not. And then there's when we've worked towards a change and it's happening.
Yes. And how do we survive it?
Right. How do we survive the results of what we set into motion?
Right. Uh,
So in music, one of the ways that we go about changing is that we practice. And there are, so I'm just going to talk about the ways that I know of to change as a
mhm.
musician. So, wow, okay. So, and as soon as I said that, I realized, I've been giving a series of classes lately where I teach people how to break music down into the building blocks because I'm a composer and that's how I've always seen it. I
Mhm.
mean, I think I've always seen music that way, and that's why I became a composer, not, but anyway. And so I think that change can sometimes happen when we understand something, when we break it down into the building blocks and we're like, oh, I see, it's like this. And then we move towards it differently.
Mhm.
Then there's change that happens because of practice. Like, for example, I've been practicing just engaging my whatever solar plexus to just kind of bring energy to the upper part of my body. And when I remember to do that, I remember to do that, and that starts to practice. And I've learned to start doing it when I touch the harp. So I'm attaching it to a habit.
Beautiful.
So there's practice. Okay, there's understanding, there's practice, there's having a practice. So I know there are times like I have a practice that every morning I do a certain set of exercises. And if I just let my mind go into that, I feel that the practice is getting to me, not that I'm getting what I'm practicing. So there's understanding, there's practice, there's practices, there's, now I'm forgetting them all. And then I notice sometimes if I simply imagine I am a different person, I will change.
Mhm.
And so I teach my students that in terms of an art of taking on an archetype, which could be my mother. Like when I first started performing, I didn't know how to walk on stage. So I imagined I was my mother. My
Mhm.
body changed. I went out there and I took on her persona in a sense.
Mhm.
So I guess I'm thinking of four right now: understanding, practice, practices, and taking on a persona. What else is there?
Wow. Well, let me tell you what was coming up for me as you
Yeah.
were saying that is that um, for me, understanding initiates a change that comes from within and moves to outside. So
Okay.
it initiates when we have an understanding that's not just intellectual knowing, but a true understanding we feel in our body. It's like we know it in our gut, we know it in the abdominal brain. Then something shifts in terms of our own cellular consciousness and body chemistry. Because feelings are always, or emotions are always accompanied by body sensation and chemical responses in the body. So, understanding can initiate a change from the inside out. Adopting a persona, like pretending to walk on stage like your mother, who was obviously a consummate performer, that is inviting a shift from the outside in.
Right.
So, we're talking about two different kinds of change. One is a change that ego consciousness invites and intends, and the other is a change that ego consciousness might tend through psychic gardening of the unconscious and of one's deep inner workings, but it isn't something that necessarily comes at your beck and call. It's
Okay, you can make your garden ready. You can make your garden ready for something to grow, but you can't.
right.
Okay.
Right. I mean, we can all put on a persona. We can all put on the costume, so to speak. You know, we can all put on the mask, which has a different meaning at this moment in time in our culture. But if we think about, how do we put on a covering, a persona, an image of someone else that might help us feel like, okay, I can step into that image. That's one thing. It's another thing to go deep within oneself and find the consummate performer that lives in one's own cellular consciousness and have an understanding of that and walk out on stage centered from that place in your solar plexus.
So what I think I hear you saying is it's one thing to take on the persona of another, and then versus the journey into the unknown to find or become the persona that you are.
Or to become the authentic self you are. Because then the authentic self can give rise to a persona, which is Greek for the word mask, by the way. The word persona is Greek for the word mask.
Okay.
And so that when we have a persona, I like to think of it as a costume we put on for the world. So right now, we're in one costume or mask. If you were playing a concert, you'd be in another. If I were sitting in my office with an analysan, but they're not adopted from the outside as something false or something we're pretending to be, but they come up and are an expression of the energy of who we are in a very localized way, specific to that moment in time and activity we're doing and interaction we're having.
Okay, so I got a little bit distracted because not because of what you were saying. I started thinking about the La Brea tar pits. I mean, when you said they come up, there's the La Brea tar pits are where there were animals got, I don't know if this is relevant, but animals got buried. They'd fall into these tar pits, and then now in the prehistoric times, and now they come up. Those bones come up from time to time, very slowly. They rise. Mm-hmm. And they come out of that, unconsciousness of the past, or at least that's how I learned it as a child. So that's what I was thinking about when you were talking about that these things come up. But what I heard you say when I got out of the La Brea tar pits was that we are creating conditions for them to come up, or there are conditions, specific conditions that are helping specific parts come up. Is that right?
Yes. Okay. And there's a beautiful myth, and Clarissa Pinkola Estes tells it in her book, Women Who Runs with the Wolves, if I'm not mistaken. But there's a beautiful myth about the singing over the bones so that they come to life. So your image of the bones coming up, the bones are the structure or the skeleton.
Right.
That's needed. And then the conscious attending to those bones is like the singing over it so that flesh forms over them and something is birthed. So it's like we give rise to the bones of our own soul in a way that then gets fleshed out for this lifetime.
And it gets fleshed out by our voice, by bringing our voice to it.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And by being willing, and I'm guessing this happened for you, and it may have just happened automatically, that now you have a way of walking out on stage that's probably a little bit different from your mother's.
Oh, yes.
That you still probably can see elements of your mother's approach in it, but it's become you. Right. You found your way. And so her bones, in a sense, the bones that are part of your heritage, part of your unconscious legacy vis-a-vis her being her child, have gotten fleshed out now in the way that's specific and unique to who you are. And this is, I believe, what we do with music when we relax into it. And as you've said, when Miles Davis said it takes a long time to sound like us, that, we learn all of what we learn. And then we sound like us, unless you're fortunate enough to begin in an environment and culture where you're just encouraged to sound like yourself from the beginning. I mean, there are some cultures where that's the case.
I suppose so. I mean, I wonder, so I'm thinking that in that moment, I only needed her to get me out on stage. I only needed that to get from literally the darkness of standing in, behind the curtain out onto the middle of the stage. And then when I got there and I could see the audience, I found my own belonging.
Yes, yeah.
So,
and I would take it a next step. You then were able to take in that sense of belonging that you found, and thus that informed your experience of walking out on stage. So a change began to happen and how you walk on stage.
Right. So each time I walked out more as me and less as her. And that came in part because of what happened in engaging with the audience and engaging with whatever I was doing. But I do remember as a little girl, I singing guitar or something at as an assembly, looking out and seeing the audience and realizing that connection. And it was almost like looking out of a cage and being like, oh my God, there's a world out here.
Right.
So I really love, all these ideas of change, as we can address them mechanically. Like when I practice a piece or a thing, I'm taking a thing that's outside of me. I'm thinking, like, here's a passage of music. I want to be able to do it. Or here's something physically that I invented and I want to be able to do it physically. So I practice it over time and over time and over time. And it's very mechanical. I'm practicing something I can't do in order to be able to do it. But a practice is when I do something I can do over and over again with an open mind to let it start working on me, so that I can be whatever it will inform me to be. And I don't know what that is.
So that's part of the journey of really becoming who we are in the fullest sense of the word, is we don't know. And when we hold on to the ego ideals we want, or the ego ideal of who we think we are, it can become like the carapace or the cage that prevents us from living into the fullness of who we are. So that willingness to step out perhaps into a way of being, a sense of experiencing an activity that we've never imagined before possible for us.
Right. So we're embracing unknownness in a sense.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, often when I'm working with people, and all of us to some degree usually need work on boundaries and our ability to say the creative no to someone so we can say the creative yes. And almost always people will start sometimes and say, I can't imagine doing that. I can't imagine saying no to that person, or I can't imagine doing that differently. So often the beginning of change is opening to the possibility, is beginning to imagine it possible. And what you were doing, and you teach your students to do about adopting a persona, is a kind of copying someone. Looking to a role model is another way we talk about it. That's one way of helping people begin to even open up to the possibility that could be like this because someone else is like this. So maybe if you can imitate them, and then maybe that imitation again catalyzes one's own deeper self.
Right. That's right. And you're making me think about the games, the musical games that I played as a child and that I play with my students.
Mm-hmm.
The imitation games where I'm playing something and they play back. I play, they play back, but it's so fast they couldn't possibly get it right. So they have to let go of getting it right.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're almost tricking ourselves into being ourselves.
Yeah, it's like we override, we give ourselves practices to override the cage. It's like we give ourselves practices that help open the door so we can get out, so to speak. And that happens, you're saying trick ourselves. It's like when we can let go of control enough, when the ego can let go of having to do it just right, doing it just this way, then something of our larger self can work on our behalf. And it happens organically. That's what you're saying.
I love what you're saying. Something of our larger self can work on our behalf.
Yes.
Versus our smaller self or whatever it is,
yes.
constantly working to keep, So one of the things you said, opening to the possibility, how we open ourselves to the possibility. And I also want to go back to this idea. I've got this idea of singing over the bones to bring the flesh out. I mean, I feel like that's what my life is. The bones being this, a simple structure that you literally sing over, because that's how music is created over and over and over and over again with endless variety and infinite, no end to it. And but as you're speaking, I'm thinking, okay, that works for me in music. How could I, and it gives me infinite creative, I mean, like there's no end. I can sit down and at the harp and take any song I've ever known since I was a child and have fun with it. Can I do that with other things in my life? No. And by doing that with music, I can see that change happens. The larger me comes into that. My playing develops on its own by doing that. Change happens. And I can see that because I'll write a piece and I'll play it one way and I'll record it. And then I'll go back and listen to that recording, 10 years later or something, and realize I'm playing it completely differently now. I think I'm playing it exactly the same, but it's very different. New parts, played differently, whatever. So change has happened.
Right. So the structure that you've identified that music has, even like I'm thinking of the rondo form that you teach.
Right.
That's one structure for a song. So we might say that if we're looking at a psychic change or a change in other areas of your life, then we might begin to look at what are the bones. So let's just play with, if we can, you're walking out on stage. Okay. So I'm imagining that when you were still the younger performer and you were adopting your mother's persona, that one of the bones that you were helping bring up, although you were doing it from the idea of adopting the persona, was this internalized experience of your mother as a performer and your ideal of what a good performer did as they came on stage. Because I'm imagining that was a lot of probably how you felt about your mother as a child and young woman, and maybe still now. Yeah. So that's one bone.
Go on.
So that was a bone that came up. And then there was probably the bone of your own sense of insecurity and youngness and am I as good as? So there's that bone that at the root had your own worth and value, but you hadn't yet lived into that. You hadn't yet fully experienced it. So that bone came up. And then there was the bone of all of the musician you've always been, because you grew up with music, you grew up playing, you grew up singing. So let's just say those three bones kind of rose to the surface, and you're going out on stage helped in a way flesh the three of them out and hold them together to give them a container that was a soft container versus a hard container of a cage or a carapace. It gave it skin. You know, our skin is a container, but it's soft. It takes things in, but it also keeps things out. So it's like we in a sense, you sang over those three bones, and I'm sure there were more than those three in there, but you sang over those bones, and something happened that knit them together.
Right. Okay, something happened that knit them together, and it happened through the song.
And it,
through
yes.
the singing, not
And
through the
for
specific
you,
song.
it happened through the singing. And we could say that the singing could be a metaphor for speaking our truth anywhere, for speaking our truth with words, with someone we're in relationship with, or speaking our truth with actions, speaking our truth in the choices we make. You know, so I'm using singing here much more broadly and symbolically than just literal singing.
And that's something I would love to do a whole session on. It's what is voice? I mean, because each person has their voice, and I don't mean their speaking voice. We have like who we are, which I think you're saying is our truth.
Yes,
our truth, which is not so easy to sing.
That's right.
And not so easy to find. So I think, just to bring this back to make sure we're not to keep us on track, as whatever, but that we are just, as we find and sing our truth, we are changing into ourselves.
I would say, as we find and sing our truth, yes, something is changing. And we are doing the work of psychic gardening to facilitate the growth of our soul. For me, the true self is the soul. Different systems of thought have different words. But I think that for me, the truth of who we really are is our soul, and living that, meaning that how I move, how I talk, what I say, the choices I make, where I put my energy, all are driven by my soul, by the energy of who I am.
Or is it
versus outside expectations?
Oh, okay. So how much of your soul can come through,
right,
rather than being inhibited by outside?
Right.
Well, see, that's really interesting. And I don't remember whether we talked about this last time, but I've been thinking a lot about how you get the gravity of yourself, like how you have your own gravitational pull towards you. And it seems like the greater truth of ourselves that we're able to sing, the greater that grounding, that sense, that core is.
Yes.
So I just want to go back and grab something. You talked about the rondo form, so I just wanted to explain to people who might not be musicians, because I also think it's a very interesting form. So the rondo form in music is basically a form where you have a melody, and then you have what's called an episode, which is different from that melody. Then you come back to the melody, you play it again, then you have another episode. And the episodes can be similar to the melody, they can be different, they can be based on a whole different idea. But I was struck, it was my very first form that I started improvising with, and I used it because that melody that I knew was a safe place. And so I called it my home free. I would sit in the home free and I would play that, and then I would explore during the episode. And when I got lost, or when I didn't think I was saying anything new, I'd come back to the melody. And then again, I'd go out into the frontier of this improvisation section, and then come back to the home safety of the melody, and then go back out into the frontier. And it was a really great way of exploration. And so I'm just wondering, since you brought it up, whether that idea of being able to have an episode of exploration and then come back, and whether that's something that we can use, not just in music, to explore finding our voice and ourselves, but how could we use that just as every day?
Oh, we can absolutely use it. In fact, I often say to my analysts, just experiment. Just, experiment with doing something different. Experiment with, let's just say you want to change the time of day you get up in the morning. So experiment with getting up at different times of day. Experiment with having a different routine. Experiment with saying something differently. If we can look at life as an experiment or an exploration and with an eye of curiosity, it so frees us up. We get caught in the cage because we want to know what's going to happen. And knowing what's going to happen forecloses exploration or experimentation. And so if you can think of all of life as an improv, a few weeks ago when we talked about, if, for instance, in cold season or virus season, you don't want to shake someone's hand, but you also don't want to offend someone, and we do the elbow bump. Just our conversation about that, a couple of weeks after that, we had to have a plumber at our house, and he came up and stuck his hand out to shake my hand, and I said, "Oh, I'm not shaking hands," and I did the elbow, and he immediately did the elbow thing. It's like experimenting. And so part of how we can use our thoughts is by opening to possibilities. And when you and I have this kind of dialogue and someone else watches it and then they engage with us because they probably have an internal dialogue going in response to what we're saying, that can be a way of seeding a thought that then grows so that all of a sudden we're confronted in a situation where we normally shake hands, but we've got this thought of the elbow bump and we do it.
So we've been given, I was going to say, let's look really practically at how someone might experiment. So
there we go.
Let's say you're sequestered in your home for 3 weeks and not going out. Let's just say, and you're, how can you experiment with your routine and yet go back to the safety? Like, if I don't even know what my routine is, I can't experiment with it.
Right. So there's got to be self-awareness. One has to develop a capacity to track what one's own behavior, one's own, not just outer behavior, but inner behavior. So, I feel a little bored, so here I am in front of the refrigerator.
Okay.
You have to develop a capacity of self-awareness. And again, as we talked before, stream of consciousness journaling, mindfulness exercises are one of the best practices to develop that.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm just having these ideas. I'm having these ideas of how to actually do this. Like, so here are my ideas that I had just in the last whatever. One was, I imagined going to the refrigerator and having a sign on it saying, first do a 10-second dance. And it's funny because I was outside running. I run and I live in a sort of rural area. So, and I went by somebody's house and they said, you could win a roll of toilet paper if you come here, ring our doorbell, and then do a dance outside on this square. And some kids had done that, and I was like, yeah, what the heck, I'll just do it. I mean, I didn't even ring the doorbell, but I just thought, well, that's a good time to dance. So I just realized, I could put a sign on my fridge and just say, do whatever you want, but first dance for 10 seconds. And then I was also thinking, well, what would it look like if I experimented with making my bed? What would that look like? So understanding what I do in the day is one thing. Well, I make my bed, I wash the dishes, I practice. Right. I could wear something special when I practice. That would be different. I could, there's so much, and I just hadn't thought about that. How I could experiment, how I could have fun. Yeah. So if I do that, which I will, how might I change? And I'm not saying, prescribe for me what changes are going to happen, but how might that change who I am and how much of me I am?
Well, it could change you in many, many different ways. One of the things that comes to my mind about, like, if you got up and made your bed, then one way it might change you is you don't feel aggravated every time you see your bed because it looks beautiful instead of unkempt.
Oh, well, Kathleen, I do make my bed.
Oh, good. Okay.
No, but what I'm saying is, I was thinking I could make it differently.
Oh, yes.
Experiment with the way I make it. How could I experiment with the way I make my bed or the way I make it look? I always make it look the same way, and it does look nice when I go in there. But what if there was a surprise as part of it?
I think it's a great idea. I mean, I think in terms of how's it going to change, it really is going to depend on what you do and what you want to have change. There are changes, of course, like the interruption of negative habit patterns, like the eating out of boredom instead of physical hunger. And by the way, I love your idea of the sign, whatever you do, dance. Often I tell people to put, when they're trying to interrupt a pattern and get self-awareness of it, to put sticky notes all over the place, reminding them to think about it,
Right.
So there are changes like that if we interrupt negative habit patterns and things that are self-destructive, of course, part of the change is going to be a greater sense of satisfaction, a greater sense of self-mastery, greater confidence. There are also changes, if we go back to your experimenting with how you make the bed, or for you, because you're such a consummate genius musician, you're playing with how you improv differently. Then for that, it may mean that what you're actually doing is finding different ways or inviting different ways of experiencing the beauty of the soul in the moment. Whether it's the beauty of the soul of the bedroom and your presence in it, because now there's this playful stuffed animal on the bed on top of your pillow, or there's a fringe pillow with bright colors that make you smile or remind you of a favorite place, or there are those kinds of changes that actually help us live into the beauty of our soul, who help us. And I do believe living into the beauty of our soul expands our creative possibilities, both in music and in life. We get more comfortable experimenting. We get more comfortable saying, oh, let me try this and see what it's like. The other thing that came to my mind a few minutes ago when you were talking was when we talked about last time flow, and that part of, I believe, change, and the other kind of change, which is the unexpected or the unanticipated,
Right.
is being able to go with the flow, and when we can have enough sense of self that comes from inside our solar plexus, which a lot of belief systems believe the soul comes in through the solar plexus and the heart chakra. But if, let's just say, you really are feeling your center, then the outside world can be changing. Like you go from leaving your house every day from 8 to 5 to being home all day and having to find a home office or a little corner to work in while your spouse is there working and your kids are on TV with the school or whatever. Then part of what increases our capacity to change is our ability to go with the flow. And our ability to go with the flow is directly related to whether we're tethered to something outside us or we're tethered to something in us.
Oh.
And when we're tethered to the something in us that is our soul or our larger self, then we do have a greater resiliency to go with the flow and adapt, thus change when the outer world begins to shift. The kind of change we've talked about facilitating from the outside in helps ultimately build that sense of self internally and that sense of one's center. So wherever we are, and we probably may be different places in different areas of our life, it's important to know that ultimately what we are looking to cultivate, that is the key to fluid changing, is the inner connection to our authentic self. And some systems talk about that as inner resources. In Jungian analysis, we talk about it as the larger self, or self with a capital S. And a lot of spiritual systems, they talk about it as the soul. It doesn't really matter to me what word we use on it, but we're talking about that authentic self, that for you, music has been a language of all your life. For some of us, that it hasn't been our language all our life. But what's important is that we have our language, and that when we do come to music, as well as I believe when we go into um, self-help systems of psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, 12-step groups, all kinds of programs, we are opening ourselves sometimes to a new language of how to connect with and express our larger self. You know, whether it's the language of words,
Mm.
it's the language of feelings, it's the language of our musical instrument. Yeah.
And you keep coming up with the word fluent, flow or fluency,
Uh-huh.
and I'm having this image of, and so I'm thinking it all together, you know, the bones, and we're singing over the bones, and then the cage, and the, you know, almost the puzzle pieces that we have glued together in our life, of
Mm-hmm.
what we think our lives are. And um, if we can make that glue fluid again, so those pieces can now start shifting around, and they can then shift into who we truly are, or being more in resonance with whatever our actual who we are. And so we're talking about the ways to do that, and we've talked about how to do it from the outside. I mean, I wouldn't, how to do it from the outside in, and how to kind of help the inside come out through
Yeah.
singing over the bones. And so all these fun things, like now I'm really excited about putting notes all over my house, so that my house is kind of like a, you know, one of those, like on the bathroom mirror, you know, make 10 funny faces before you do anything. You
Mm-hmm.
know, on the fridge, dance for 10 seconds before you do anything. You know, that I don't know what's going to come out of this. What I'm doing is breaking up that puzzle that I've glued together, so that it can take the new shape of who I am, that will resonate more truly.
That's right. That's right. So that the golden cage becomes actually fluid gold.
So the thing the shape
Mhm.
you've created, the construct
Right.
that you have been living, can completely melt and become something completely different.
Right. Right. But the gold, the essence of the soul, the essence of the truth of who you are is still there.
Right. It's only
Yeah.
just changed shape.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And we might say that instead of glue, we have sinew, we have ligaments, we have things like hold the bones of the body together that are fluid in a way. They're elastic, they move. You know,
Wow. And I could make them even more elastic. I mean, like as we stretch, we can make them
that's right. That's right.
more.
Just like with our literal body. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. Well, I am excited to actually start doing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as you said that, you know, the gold of a cage can melt, and then I saw it and become a trumpet. You know, it could become something that allows us to speak.
Mm.
I mean, and by speak, I mean speak,
Yes. Express.
express,
Yeah.
right? Speak the language that only we have. I mean, we have a language between us, but each of us has our own language.
That's right.
Wow. So I don't even know how I could recap what we said, but I'm just so excited to get started
Mhm.
trying some of this and see what changed. Now, last question. What can I do to help myself accept any changes that might happen?
Practice loving kindness towards yourself.
Oh,
That you can really practice the arms of love, acknowledgement, recognition of what's happening, respect, validating it, and having gratitude for it. Mhm.
okay. So that means that after I make the 10 funny faces in front of the mirror, I can clap and say, good job, brava, bravissima. And
Yes,
same thing after I do my dance. Okay, so
yes,
that's a big part of that. Okay,
yes,
great.
yes.
Wow. Is there anything more that that you would like to say, Kathleen, about this?
Yeah, I just want to say be bold and change. I think that
Bold,
when
be
we can
daring,
be bold and change.
I'll be the three musketeers of my own life.
That's right. Okay.
Kathleen, thank you so much.
You're
This is
welcome.
such a wonderful message and such a wonderful list of things that I can do
Mm-hmm.
to on the adventure towards myself.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye bye. See you next week.
Okay.